Okay, welcome everybody to our wonderful fourth session with Anna Urowitz Freudenstein. We are so delighted to have her back. As I say, this is the fourth in our series about extraordinary Jewish women. I'm Randy Fine. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Women of Adath, and I'm really pleased to welcome you all here today. Anna is going to do this in the way that we have done it before. She's going to begin with some of her wonderful slides and explanations. Somewhere around the middle, we will take a break. If you have questions, please put them into the Q&A and we will try and address them at the break and then again towards the end of the session. So sit back, enjoy, and let's learn about all these wonderful Midrashic biblical women. Over to you, Anna.
Hi, everybody. I think you can hear me now. We tried something a little bit different for the technical aspects this afternoon compared to other weeks. So I had to click some slightly different buttons. So I think if it wasn't working, I would have heard by now. So hi, everybody. Welcome back or welcome for the first time. If it's your first time, we're happy to have you. And actually the way I've structured things is to make sure that in case you're not with us for every single session, that hopefully you'll be able to still follow along. In fact, I know you'll be able to follow along. Today's session is very different than what we saw before, because from my perspective at least, because our base that we were working off of last time or up until now has really been the Tanakh, has been the Bible. And we looked at, or I picked out interesting women for us to investigate. And then we did our investigations by looking at some historical things, looking at some things in the biblical text itself, and then occasionally going over to rabbinic interpretations as well. Today, we are focusing more on rabbinic interpretations, the type of interpretations, called midrash, or midrashim is the plural. I've made it English in our title by using the word midrash here as an adjective, or is it an adverb? Because it's actually, I think it's an adverb because I think it is modifying another adjective that is biblical. So we're talking about women in the Bible that are sometimes not actually even there. Sometimes they were only alluded to. Sometimes they're assumed to be there. This will become much more clear as we get to our examples. But there seem to be hints of them in the text that then our ancient rabbis picked up on and wrote commentaries about. The types of these biblical commentaries are called midrashim. So actually today, what we're going to do is learn more about certain biblical women, but in doing so, we will actually be learning a little bit about how rabbinic midrash works, what it's all about. So we'll be seeing women that are missing from the text, but are alluded to or could be assumed. And then sometimes we will be talking about very obscure women who are really only mentioned once, and yet these midrashim are able to expand our ideas about them. So that's why I've come up with this slightly awkward, but hopefully now understandable title, namely Midrashic Biblical Women. We are going to start at the beginning. In the beginning, we talked about the first man and woman being created in our first class together a few weeks ago. And today we're going to start off with the very next generation. And then we're going to hop around and do a whole bunch of other things as well. So here we go. Kane and Abel, just a little refresher in case you don't remember. These are two brothers, and they are the first people actually born. We have Adam and Eve as being created by God, and then we have their first two sons. They go on to have other children afterwards, but their first two sons are Cain and Abel. And that's the way the process goes, the story goes in creation. And so now that we have people being born, we know that we need both male and female to come together in order for that conception and eventual birth to happen. The problem is now, where are the women going to come from for Cain and Abel to marry? As it turns out, the way the story ends, which doesn't really affect what we're talking about today, is that Abel, or Havel in Hebrew, actually does die. He's killed by his brother Cain before he has a chance to marry someone. But presumably before that happens, there would be an idea for them to marry. And so we need some women around. Where are those women going to come from? Okay, because up until now, and so we are in chapter 4 of the book of Genesis, for traditional perspective, we only got 4 people in the world. And so we need some extra women happening. Although there are other Midrashim perhaps that even puts Eve into that role in terms of a potential partner for each of her sons, but we're not going to go there today. All right. Instead, we're going to go with a different Midrash. And I mean, all of these things sound not exactly palatable to our ears. If there's only a few people involved in the world, existing in the world, there's going to be some what we would call incest happening. But the idea of that does not exist yet in Judaism. The Torah has not been given. And there's different ideas in the Torah about other kinds of expectations about sexual morality that come after the time of the flood. So we're before that as well. We're really at a very kind of Wild West, almost anything goes time in Judaism, way, way back in the beginning. Nevertheless, we need some women into the picture. There's a Midrash in Bereshit Rabbah that fills that in for us. I have it here in Hebrew. And then I have the English as, instead of just straightforward translation, I've got a translation and a bit of a chart for us because there's going to be a tiny bit of math involved with this. The idea is that the first 2 got on the bed. That would be Adam and Eve, the first sexual union in the world. But then 7 came off of it, not all at once, but as a result of this union of Adam and Eve, that there are 7 offspring at first. Later on in the story, actually more end up happening, but we're only interested in the beginning of the beginning. So what are we talking about the number 7 here? Okay, so the number 7 is broken down this way. Cain, he's the oldest. He apparently had a twin sister. Okay, so that's 1 and 1. Then Abel, we learned about him. He's the second son. He actually has 2 twin sisters, which I guess makes him triplet, one of a triplet, but the way it's phrased in the Hebrew, it says twin. So we got triplets going on here, fraternal, of course. And so we got 1 plus 2. And then we have the original Adam and Eve. So if you do this addition, you get to the number 7. So these are the 7 people who are the first and second generation of human beings ever. If you add them up, this is what it comes to. Now, this is the rather fanciful idea. Like if you wanted to say, all right, somehow there were girls born and maybe even twin sisters born, because we know of certain conceptions and certain births, you'd say, okay, fine. The Torah doesn't care quite as much about reporting female births. And unfortunately, we're going to see this a number of times in our talk today. But this is really weird. Why 2 twin sisters with Abel? So we have to dig a little bit deeper into the biblical text itself to understand how the rabbis came up with this midrash. Oh, sorry, here's the math again. And here's the biblical text that I want to look at together with you. So again, from chapter 4 of the book of Genesis, and we see here about the conception and birth of both Cain and Abel. What I have done for you in the Hebrew is I have in red highlighted 3 words. The word at appears 3 times in this in these 2 verses. Now, I couldn't highlight them for you in English because they're not translatable in English. It's really a grammatical tiny word there. I think it's called a particle. And it's necessary in Hebrew grammatically, or it's appropriate. The question is whether it's necessary or not. But in English, we don't have such a thing. So it's not, I couldn't highlight it for you in English because it doesn't exist in the English translations. But the idea is that these are tiny little words that don't really add to the meaning of the text. They're necessary there grammatically, but they're not necessary, but they don't add meaning. Well, this is our first starting of our understanding of what, how the rabbis, our ancient rabbis, kind of perform this feat of commentary known as Midrash, in that they very often, and there's different types of Midrash, but in this case, they dug deep into the text, and they look very often in every single word, sometimes even parts of words, often letters, sometimes even parts of letters, because the idea is their understanding was the entire biblical text, even parts that didn't seem important, were all holy and all important, were all directly the word of God. And so if there was something in there that seemed unnecessary or even redundant, then it must be there for a reason. And if the reason wasn't explicit in the understanding of the given verse, then they could understand that there was a deeper understanding there. And the deeper understanding is presented to us here through the Midrash. So these three extraneous, seemingly extraneous words here, or unnecessary words, to the rabbis got a great importance attached to them. And they said, if this is talking about conception and birth of this first first earthbound birth in the world, then perhaps there were more conceptions and births going on. Well, actually not conceptions because they were twins. So more births going on. And so we have three of these words here. So these three could represent other people being born. And we don't need any more men born. We need some women born here. So in fact, that these three represent those three first daughters who were born, those twin sisters that were born alongside Cain and Abel. And the way the wording happens in the first verse, for Cain, it says at Cain, there's only one of those little extra words. But for the description of Abel, he's described not only as Abel or Hebel in Hebrew, but as the brother of the one who had already been born. So it just mentions that he's a brother and then his name Abel. And so because of that, that little extra word appears twice, once as brother, introducing the word brother, and once introducing his name. So we have three extras. Well, that's going to add us up to 7 because we have Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, that's 4. And then the 3 leftovers, those 3, well, leftovers isn't a nice way to say it. The 3 extra, the 3 extra are represented by those 3 words that seem extraneous, but in fact are here to teach us that 3 daughters were born at the same time. And so those are the 3. So we now have discovered through the deep digging of Midrash that there are actually 3 sisters born along with these 2 brothers, which should give them ample opportunity to find women to marry. So, and it doesn't exactly go on to explain how that happened, but it's an opportunity is there. So the idea is we have found some women in the beginning of our human story who weren't necessarily in the text, and they are grounded in this close reading of the text that is done by using Midrash by our ancient rabbis. So those are the first Midrashic women, because we discovered them via Midrash, that I wanted to present to you in the Bible. Okay, new idea, okay? Mothers. So as I think almost everyone knows, that the traditional way, which is actually changing in our day and age, but the traditional way of referring to someone by their Hebrew name very often is so-and-so, the son or daughter of someone else, of so-and-so. But that so-and-so is usually the father. Traditionally, mothers' names are sometimes used alone, very rarely. Now, in modern times, usually often both the mother's and father's name is mentioned. But in ancient times, of course, it was only the father. People didn't have last names. Last names are a fairly new phenomenon. And so you referred to as, for instance, like David, the son of Ishai. Okay, so not David, Manischewitz or Freudenstein or whatever, but rather David ben Ishai, the son of Ishai. I'm referring here to King David. So we're missing a lot of mothers' names in the Bible. And apparently at some point in history, it's something that I think that we might be very interested in. But even in our classical rabbinic literature, there's one piece of the Talmud that has a question about mothers that seem to be not named of certain biblical characters. All right, let's see how that works. So this is actually a portion from the Talmud, from Tractate Baba Batra. And in the middle of a discussion that really is not connected to this at all, there's an interesting little piece that I'm sharing with you here. I think I have it spread out over 2 slides. So the name of the rabbi that's kind of presenting this discussion is this, and Rav Hanan ben Rava says that Rav says, the mother of Abraham, wow, Abraham, gee, we know from the biblical story his father's name was Terach, but we don't know his mother's name. Wouldn't that be interesting? The first Jew to know his mother's name. She wasn't Jewish, but it would be interesting to know her anyway. Apparently, we have her name right here. Her name was Amatlai bat Karnevo. You'll see in a minute why I did these different colors. Wow, now all of a sudden we have Abraham's name. How fascinating. Now, interestingly, we have a second biblical character who wouldn't have thought of necessarily in connection with Abraham, and that is Haman, the bad guy of the Purim story. So, pardon me one second. The mother of Haman was called Amatlai, what? Same first name. Interesting coincidence. Bat Urowitz. So, interesting. Same first name. Could have all different kinds of commentaries here about good and evil, maybe, but that's not what we're doing right now. That both Abraham and Haman had mothers with the same first name. Maybe it was a common first name. I don't know. But they aren't connected other than that they have the same first name. And just so we shouldn't get them confused, though, we are given what would be equivalent to their last names, namely the names of their fathers. Because as I said before, you're always known as so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, or the so-and-so, the daughter of so-and-so as well. So we have here Amatlai bat Karnevo is the mother of Abraham, and Amatlai bat Urowitz, the mother of Haman. And now we have the Talmud goes on to explain this a little bit more. It actually is giving us a little tip to how to differentiate between the two, and it teaches a certain lesson as it does that. So it's saying basically, if you're worried about getting confused between these two women, it's giving us a short form or kind of a way of a memorizing technique for them by using a symbol. Okay, and your symbol to ensure that the two are not confused one for the other is that a raven is impure. Okay, it actually flips the order as it was presented above. So green goes with green here. The word Orevti, the first 2 syllables of it actually matches up with another word in Hebrew that is Orev, which means a raven. Okay, and that is impure, it's an unkosher animal. And so if that compare it to, and therefore it goes with the impure one. You wouldn't have a crow, a black impure crow going with Abraham. But a sheep in Hebrew, or I think Aramaic, I'm not sure, is a kar. See that? That's the first syllable of Abraham's grandfather's name. And that is white and pure, and of course, if killed properly, is a kosher animal, and therefore goes with the pure one. Oh, I typed something wrong. I'm sorry. I'll have to go back in and fix it. But the idea is here, it's meant to say the pure one. Okay, so what we have here is if you have Talai, oh, one's the daughter, one's the son of one's the daughter of so and so, and the other's the daughter of so and so. How am I going to remember? Oh yes, the one that sounds like crow goes with Haman. The one that sounds like a nice white fluffy sheep goes with Abraham. Okay, so it's giving us a tip to remember, but it's also sending us a message about who is Abraham and who is Haman. In that same portion, it continues on a few lines more, and it just starts giving us other biblical characters, their mother's names, with really no further explanation. And there aren't really other explanations about this. They're just kind of stated. So we have the mother here of King David. As I said, his father's name was Yishai, Jesse. We know that. We don't know his mother's name until now. It is Nuts Bat Adael. Anyone looking for any baby names? I don't know. It's kind of hard to pronounce. The mother of Samson was named Salphonite. Actually, there are other Midrashim about her, but I'm not going to get into it now. And now, as an extra bonus, we even get a sister's name in this case, also until now totally anonymous from the Bible. Her name is Nashian. Okay, so we now all of a sudden have a rabbinic tradition that gives us three women's names that we would not know otherwise because they're not found in the Bible itself. So now there's kind of an internal comment here in the Talmud, and it says, what's the practical difference as to what their names were? Basically saying, who cares? Like, we've been getting along just fine with the father's names only. Why are you all of a sudden bothering us with the names of the mothers? Okay, I think this is how I envision their discussion happening in the Talmud. And they give an answer to their question. It's important with regard to an answer for heretics. Okay, so I think there are a lot of different ways of interpreting this, but basically, the way you could look at it, one way is people saying, your Bible, it's missing a lot of stuff. Like, how come it doesn't say the mother's names? Mothers are important too. Maybe that means that your Bible is not good enough, that there's mistakes in it, that there's omissions in it. And so if that's the case, then you can say, no problem. We have a tradition to fill in those alleged omissions. Another way of thinking about in terms of heretics here, which could actually have to do with the early Christians who existed at this time. The Talmud was put together about the 5th century CE, 6th century CE, is that, of course, even though the Christians believe in what they call the Old Testament, what we call the Tanakh, they don't believe in our oral tradition, everything that we have written down in the Mishnah and the Talmud and all the other oral traditions. So the idea is here to demonstrate to the heretics that you don't get the whole story, in this case, the mother's names, unless you understand the written Torah and the oral Torah together. They're two pieces of the same larger holy entity. And so if you think you can, figure everything out in Judaism with just the written Torah, you're wrong. According to Judaism, you need to have all these other oral traditions as well that were passed down by the rabbis and eventually written down in rabbinic literature. All right, well, you know what? I think that I have now two more kind of major ideas that I'm going to do. Before I get to them, then I think we can stop now for a question break in case anyone has any questions. The way my screen looks today, I can't see if there are any, so I'm going to have to hear from you guys if there are any questions today.
Hi.
Anyone?
I think.
Randy.
Can you
or Anna?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Randy. Yes.
Okay. I don't have any questions.
Oh, yet. Okay. Yeah.
No but problem. I have a question.
Oh,
I have a question. So where did these names come from? They're not in the Torah. Who decided this was the mother or the sister?
Right. So this actually, God forbid, I'm not referring to you as a heretic, but this is really relates very much back to what I just said, which I said in about 3 sentences. And truthfully, to really talk about it, we need, hours and hours. So I'm sorry if I did it too quickly. Let me try to expand a little bit more now. I can't give you the whole story, but I'll give you part of it. Basically, in Judaism, we have something called the written Torah and the oral Torah. The Torah should be a Ketab and the Torah should be al-Peh. The confusing part is that what we call the oral Torah that we transmitted, from mouth to ear, is actually now written down. So it does get very, very confusing. But the idea is that from a traditional perspective, what was given on Mount Sinai, again, we're only doing from a traditional perspective here, because that would have been how the rabbis of the Talmud looked at it themselves. From a traditional perspective, we have the written Torah given by Moses on Mount Sinai, but then it's not enough to lead a full Jewish life and to have a full understanding of Judaism. In order to have that full and more complete and correct understanding of Judaism, we need the oral supplement that, from traditional perspective, was also passed down, was given to Moses and Mount Sinai. From a more modern perspective, and there's different variations of this, but from a more modern perspective, it's the kind of ideas that were developed originally by our religious leaders, eventually our rabbis, over time. And we need that to supplement the written. So and then it was original, and then eventually it was written down in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, and all different kinds of rabbinic books over time, and then even continues to this day. The idea of a rabbi being a continuer of all the previous traditions and keeping them on, passing them on. So sometimes we can understand where these oral traditions came from. Sometimes they are based on different rules. They're called exegetical methods, rules of interpretation that were passed down also, and that demonstrate to our religious leaders how to dig into the text further in order to understand an idea. So for instance, the idea that I talked about before about counting those little extra words, seemingly extra words, that concept of paying attention to those extra words is an idea that's passed down in the oral Torah, and then implementing it is something that our rabbis would have done and continue to do. However, sometimes it's just a tradition that we assume was passed, and there's different rules like that too. But sometimes it's just a tradition that we assume was passed down orally, and it's very strange, but it happens often that it wasn't actually written down until a later date. So as I said, this piece of the Talmud might not have been written down until 5th or 6th century Babylonia. I suppose there's a chance that a rabbi there made it up and wrote it down, but more likely it was written down, passed down orally from generation to generation. And if it's just oral, we don't have a record of it. Or sometimes they actually talk about that they had certain, I don't know if they're books, but certain notes that were kept and passed down in an informal way from generation to generation, and we don't have record of that either. So I don't have a definite answer for you, but I have a lot of different things to think about based on your question.
Thank you. Okay. Somebody asked,
please.
I guess a clarification. Was the first Jew considered Adam and Eve? Were they considered the first Jews, or Abraham?
No, so it's Abraham. This one I'm quite definitive about. Because it's something that I have thought about quite a bit. This is not my innovation, though. I think what's fabulous about Judaism is that our Bible starts before Judaism. That the idea is that God has a purpose for the world, in that God created the world and created humanity as a whole, and has certain expectations of humanity as a whole in terms of different ethical rules to follow and how one should conduct oneself, and that those ideas still exist within Judaism, that there is an idea that everyone, Jew or not, is created in the image of God and is part of God's plan, and has an expectation to lead good and moral lives. And then within that, there's a subset of humanity, namely the Jews that are, as you know, from our tradition, are considered to be chosen for a special purpose. And it is that subset that once the world is created and there's expectations for the world as a whole, and that God has a relationship with humanity as a whole, that there is a different relationship with the Jewish people, starting off with Abraham, and that is not to negate the previous relationship with the rest of the world. It is just different than it.
Okay. And one more question.
Okay.
Are there any Midrashic interpretations as to the character or personality of these women? Just names.
Yeah, no, these ones, no. We'll see the next two that we're going to talk about. We do learn a little bit more about them. So this is kind of a bit of a tease for us in that we get names and really nothing else. But there is a genre of literature in modern Hebrew, but I've seen some in English as well, that take names of these biblical women, and there are authors that kind of specialize in this and write modern novels where they kind of use their imagination and sometimes some knowledge of ancient Near Eastern history to create ideas about them. As a matter of fact, we're talking right next about Joseph's wife. And with part of that, we're going to have to talk about Dinah, who's mentioned in one chapter of the Bible, and almost nothing is known about her. But there's a very famous modern novel called The Red Tent that you might have heard of, that was written about just those tiny little scraps of information that are given to us from the text. So for all the authors out there of novels, hopefully I'm giving you some good ideas and get out there and write those good novels.
More Netflix series. Okay, one more question. One more question.
Please, go
is it acceptable to question the oral tradition? Is there an allowance for, quote, broken telephone?
I'm handing that one to your rabbi.
Are we asked to accept it as sacrosanct? I'm just asking the question. You can deal with it.
Okay, well, I think that's an amazing question for Rabbi Cutler. And I would say that they're depending on what flavor of Judaism you are, that there are lots of different answers to that question. But I would say amazing question for Rabbi Cutler.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. Back to you.
All right. Wonderful. I'm going back. So Joseph's wife. Okay. So what we have now are two last examples, which are longer. So it's going to take us the whole time. I have to actually watch the time now. We have women who are mentioned in the Bible, but that we learn more about them from the Midrashim. So before we had examples of women that we could have assumed maybe were there. We knew these people had mothers. We knew that, Cain and Abel should have had women around to be their wives, but we weren't given that explicit information by the Torah itself. This time we have names, very little information, and the Midrash expands on the little information that we do have. Okay, so the first one here has to do with Joseph's wife. Okay, you all remember Joseph, an amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and he's terribly important because after our first three patriarchs, Adam and Abraham confused, excuse me. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob had, 12 sons, but, he had a lot of sons. Joseph turns out to be really one of the most important in terms of being passed along in terms of a leadership role. Who's going to be the immediate leader right after, it turns out, depending on your perspective, to be Joseph. All right, so he becomes very, very important. So our question is, who is Joseph's wife? The text itself actually gives us the answer in Genesis chapter 14. It says this very interesting, Joseph at this point is already in Egypt. Remember, he was sold off by his brothers. They were originally going to kill him. They put him in the pit and they sold him off to travelers, and he ends up in Egypt. He ends up, well, I'm not going to go through the whole story now, but eventually he ends up in the palace of Pharaoh. This is not the Pharaoh of the of the Pesach story. This is an earlier pharaoh, and he rises in power in Egypt, and he is given a special Egyptian name by Pharaoh at this point. The name is Safnach Paneah, and then the Pharaoh presents him with a wife, and her name is Asenath in English. In Hebrew, it's Osnat. Okay, Asenath has to do with, I think it's the Greek translation of the Bible, but anyway, so I'll probably use the word Osnat. It's easier for me to say. And she is actually, we learn about her two things, that her father's name and her father's job. Okay, her father's name was Potipharah, and he is priest of On. Well, this is very interesting for us because we've already, if you know the Joseph story, have heard of someone named Potiphar and Potiphar's wife, who tried to seduce Joseph when he was a slave, a servant in her house. And the question, of course, for the rabbis is could this somehow be connected? Potiphar and Potiphar sounds awfully close. The other thing that I believe, we don't know this for sure, but that was bothering the rabbis at this point is that Joseph, who became so important for the Jewish people, married someone who was the daughter of a priest in Egypt, of an idolatrous priest. And I think this does not sit well with them. Okay, so let's see what the Midrash does here. Before this, though, I did mention there's another woman who we have not studied yet, but we kind of need as a background information. Way back in Genesis chapter 31, we learn about Jacob's one daughter. Remember, he has all those sons, but he does have one daughter who unfortunately is sometimes forgotten about, maybe because she's a girl, and also because she falls very much out of the story. She does not become a tribe like her brothers do, and something very horrible happens to her. Namely, she is raped. Again, people who have read the novel The Red Tent will have heard of this, or have listened closely to the Parshat of Shavua when this happens, when we read it in the Torah. We do learn very little about the rape itself. There's a consequence of it that is further on in the chapter that actually does not ever mention Dinah again. So in terms of who she was, though, we only learn about the rape, unfortunately. So we know that she's the daughter of Leah and Jacob, and she went out to visit the daughters of the land. Very unclear what that means. She had all those brothers. Maybe she wanted to hang out with some girls. But it's at that point that someone named Shem, who was the son of the chief of the country, saw her, took her, and lay with her by force. So he raped her. Now we have all the background information. We can see the Midrash. First of all, the Midrash answers the question, what does that mean she was going out and hanging out or being with the daughters of the land? Which I guess wasn't seen as the correct and proper thing for a daughter of Israel to do. This is how that she happened to be in that position, which ended up getting her in trouble. Because the daughter of Jacob was abiding in the tents, normally she hung out at home, but she did not go out into the street. What did Shem, the son of Hamor, do? He was planning on raping her, but he needed to get her out of the house first. He brought dancing girls who were also playing on pipes in the street. Music, dancing, okay? Interesting. So Dinah went first to see those girls who were making merry. She heard all that wonderful commotion going on outside, so she left the house. At that point, he used the opportunity, so it was a trap, to seize her and slept with her. Not only was she raped, at that point she actually conceived, and she gave birth to a daughter named Asenath or Osnat, the same Osnat we were talking about. Now, this is really bizarre. What we have here is Joseph's sister giving birth to Osnat, conceived through a rape. The sons of Israel said she should be killed. Okay, the brothers, there's a whole other kind of interesting biblical discussion that goes on there, the consequence of the rape, but they don't like the fact that she not only was raped, but she obviously had sex out of wedlock, and now that is clear and evident to everyone because they could see that she actually was pregnant from it and actually gave birth to a child. For they said now people would say in the land that there was an immoral daughter in the tents of Jacob. Very old-fashioned perspective, but obviously the Bible's an old-fashioned document. What did Jacob do? Okay, so his the father here saw, okay, there's a problem. His sons are saying that, my sister acted improperly. Everyone's going to be talking badly about us. What are we going to do? So similar actually to what happened for instance, in the United States and Canada up until the 1950s and 60s and beyond, that sometimes they hid the pregnancy and then took the child and put it up for adoption, right? And when in this type of situation. And in fact, this is a kind of a version of that. When it says, what did Jacob do? This baby is now here. We don't need this baby as evidence of this rape or to remind us of it. So he wrote the holy name of God upon a golden plate and suspended it around her neck and sent her away. So a kind of a necklace here, but a necklace that's filled with potential miraculous power because it has God's name written out on it. So here now there's this baby or child with God's name written on a necklace. And what's now going to happen to this baby? God's going to protect this baby. How does that happen? Everything is revealed before the Holy One. He knew what was God, knew what was going on. And Michael, or Michael the angel, descended and took that baby, scooped her up, and brought her down to Egypt to the house of Potiphar, because Osnat was destined to become the wife of Joseph. Yes, she was his niece, but again, an uncle-niece marriage would not have been unusual. And the idea is that she was destined to be his niece. So how all of this is going to work out? Now, the wife of Potiphar was barren, and Osnat grew up with her as a daughter. So that same, well, if it's the same Potiphar or if it's a different one, but how it is, I mean, I guess adoption wasn't exactly a normal situation in those days, especially adopted babies that show up on your doorstep with God's name on their jewelry that an angel had presented there. But the family had not been able to conceive, so I guess they were ecstatic to discover this child, and then they raised her as their own. When Joseph came down to Egypt, he married her, as we saw before, and here's the verse that Pharaoh gave her as his wife, gave her to Joseph as his wife. So what we have here is a number of quite amazing things from a rabbinic point of view. First of all, we have Joseph marrying someone in the family, okay, which would have been considered a good thing for the rabbis, marrying someone who is not related by blood to a priest of On, namely an idolatrous god. So even though she was raised in a house, she's not related to him by blood. That would have been seen as a good thing. And we have now more information about a biblical character that we would have otherwise known nothing about. She was mentioned, but nothing else was known about her. So now we know more about her, that her mother was Dinah, that she's connected to Joseph himself by blood. It also serves as teaching us not only about Osnat and Joseph and who he's destined to marry, but also helps us fill in a hole in the story about what happens next for Dinah, and namely the result of the rape. So it actually fills in quite a few gaps for us about Dinah and about Osnat, who she is and where she came from, and why she would be a correct wife for Joseph. All right, so that's our filling in the gaps of information about Osnat and a little bit about Dinah. And now in a similar vein, we have another woman who is mentioned for us 3 times in the Bible in very unusual ways. We'll see it in a minute, and no further information is given about her, but the rabbis supplied lots of information. I'm going to explain how all of this works. In the interest of time, we'll see I might be summarizing some of the stories for us rather than reading it. All right, so this is the woman that we're talking about. Her here, the name looks awfully funny in the English. Serach, it's Serach, right? There's no ch sound in English. So I have substituted here with a CH. Sometimes it's a little bit confusing and there's just an H written for her in English, which is a little bit weird because it looks like the name Sarah or Sarah then, which is a different name. So I spelled it out in English in this unusual way in order to differentiate who she is from other names. And to really emphasize her really uniqueness. So who is she? She is the daughter of Asher. Remember when I talked about before that Jacob had many, many sons? One of those sons, like Reuben, Levi, Jacob, not sorry, Reuben, Levi, Yehuda, excuse me, all this is Zebulun, Issachar. Hopefully some of those names are familiar to you. So one of the names is Asher or Asher. And he has a daughter named Sarah. You might think, okay, so fine, that's not a big deal, except for it's a huge deal because there's a list of Jacob's descendants, all of Jacob's descendants, who went down to Egypt to meet up with Joseph there at the end of the book of Genesis. 70 people the clan had grown at that point to 70 people. And there are approximately that number listed there, all male names, all male. And they're all the sons of and grandsons of Jacob. There is one female mentioned in the whole thing. And some of the names are very unusual to us, and they might sound like they're feminine names. We can't tell if they're male or female, but we can because they're listed as sons of or brothers of. And this time we have specifically only one name, Sarah. Here it is in the Hebrew. And she is specifically defined as their sister, the sister of the sons of Asher. Very strange. So it really stands out. Remember I said before, the rabbis would be looking at the text with very, very careful eyes, looking at all the details. Every single detail is important, whether you realize it or not. And so something as strange as only one woman listed among 70 would definitely be noticeable to them. Definitely. So that kind of pops out. Then you have a different listing of names. Hundreds of years later, supposedly here, as I wrote here on the side, the Jews then lived were in Egypt for many years, were enslaved in many years, hundreds of years, came out of Egypt, walked through the desert, okay? And that was 40 years, of course, in the desert. Pardon me, just readjusting my chair. At some point in the desert, in the book of Numbers, not a coincidence, it's a lot of numbers, there's a census given or taken of the people listed and with numbers attached to each tribe. For instance, at this point, the clan of Asher's descendants, the tribe of Asher, numbered more than 53,000 people, according to the Bible. Not all of them are listed, of course, but the heads of different groupings, different clans within the tribe are named. And of all of those names, again, only one woman. That same Sarah is mentioned. All male names, the entire list, except for one. So there's something going on here with this woman, Sarah, and the rabbis would like to figure out what it is. I did mention that she's mentioned a third time. It's in the book of Chronicles, and it's an exact repeat here of the one in Numbers, so I didn't bother bringing it for you. All right. So the idea is here, if she's first mentioned going down for Egypt, and then she is mentioned again coming out of Egypt, and she's noticeable, she stands out, rabbis noticed her, they used here a logical deduction. It's not even really a rabbinic principle necessarily. It's just using logic. So it doesn't sound very logical actually, but it's the kind of logic. If Sarah bat Asher could live for hundreds of years, if we noticed her and she actually was mentioned there and there, that means she's still alive, first of all, okay? And now not only that, if she's lived that many years, perhaps she could actually live even longer than those hundreds of years and perhaps even forever. And in fact, I didn't bring them for you, but there are some Midrashim that actually record her on a list of other characters from Jewish history, from biblical history, that are said to enter heaven, Gan Eden, alive, and therefore still be alive. The most famous of that known is Eliyahu Hanavi, the prophet Elijah, but so there's lists of ideas of different biblical characters who are supposed to have lived forever, and she often pops up on those lists. So I'm going to share with you a few stories now about the Sarah bat Asher, but the idea is that this fantastical or miraculous, however you want to refer to it, idea of living for hundreds and hundreds of years, or maybe even forever, she actually is shown in these stories as having gained a tremendous amount of experience and therefore wisdom, and is utilized appropriately by the community for this wisdom and is admired because of it. So she becomes a tremendous resource. And I think it's a wonderful thing in terms of there's a woman that plays this role in our Jewish tradition, not well known, but a woman. And also, I do also love the idea about the gaining of experience is seen as going hand in hand with someone who has wisdom. All right, so one story or midrash that is taught about Serach Bar Asher talks about her personality a little bit. Remember, you want to fill in a little bits of her personality, and this one does. And this one also gives a further explanation as to why she's granted this longevity. So Jacob's sons, who had sold their brother Joseph into slavery and told their father he was dead, later discovered Joseph was second only to Pharaoh in Egypt. Okay, we now have this family problem that the brothers now know their brother Joseph is alive. Jacob is very old, has already mourned the rest of his life about the tragic death of this son. He believed he was dead. And now they're afraid that telling him will actually cause problems, perhaps to his health, to his heart, or further problems within the family. So how to reveal the truth? The brothers now had to tell Jacob that he was alive. Afraid of breaking this news to their elderly father too suddenly, they decided to employ Asher's daughter, Sarah, who at that point still would have been of a normal age. This is one of the first times we hear about her. So she's to take, I guess, this well-known, perhaps favorite granddaughter of Jacob's to break the news to him, because apparently she could play the harp in a soothing manner. Beautiful story also about music. At her uncle's instigation, she sat near Jacob and sang repeatedly. She sang the song, "Joseph, my uncle, is alive and rules over the land of Egypt." So instead of just telling him, they told him with music, with beautiful music by his granddaughter. So he was delighted with this lyric revelation. And the Spirit of God came upon him, and he knew that all she said was true. It wasn't just a song, that in fact it was all true. And so as a consequence, Jacob blessed Sarah and said to her, "My child, may death never rule over you, for you brought my spirit back to life." It's like I was as dead, because here my son Joseph I thought was dead, and now you have revived my spirit, and so I'm going to bless you with eternal life. Okay, so this is the beginning of a story that's probably, definitely put down on paper, but maybe written even much later, that capitalizes on this idea of she lived such a long time. How did that happen? And where does that come from? And this midrash comes to fill in those gaps for us. Here's another one. So now we've learned that how it came to be that she lives forever. This particular one now shares with us this idea about experience and tradition. Passing down tradition is really an aspect of wisdom. So this midrash, which is much longer, talks about a secret code that was shared by our ancestors about the timing of the redemption. That the idea was that the redemption from Egypt, this is the redemption from Egypt, that was delivered to Abraham, to our father Abraham, that Abraham, during the covenant of the pieces, the Brit Ben Tarim, was told that one day his descendants would go down to Egypt and be slaves there, and then God would take them out. That he was told then more secrets that aren't necessarily for us in the Bible, but that might have been passed down from father to son, which is in fact what this midrash says. Our father Abraham delivered them to Isaac, his son, and Isaac to Jacob, his son. And then Jacob delivered the secret of the redemption to Joseph, who you might say was his favorite son, right? He gave him that coat of many colors. And he said to him, this is it, that the verse, it's actually in these two words in Hebrew, pakod, yifkod. Those two words are part of a secret code. If you hear those two words again, then you'll know that it's legitimate, that the redemption has come, and whoever is bringing this news is telling something true rather than false. Joseph then told his brothers what their father had said, and he told them these two words, pakodivkod. Once we hear this, or our descendants do, then we'll know the redemption has finally come. Asher, the son of Jacob and the brother of Joseph, told this secret of the redemption to Sarah, his daughter. And supposedly nobody else. The idea might have died with that generation, except Sarah has that bit of experience, has that bit of tradition, and then she survives so many years, and so is able to pass it along then. When Moses and Aaron came to the elders of Israel and performed the miracles in their sight, this is after, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, it's late. After they got the burning bush, and that God said it's now time for Moses to rise up and become the, I'm just going to paraphrase here, and become the redeemer in Israel and take the people out of Egypt, that they didn't believe him, of course. You know, they'd been slaves for so many years, but apparently then he knew to say the words God said to Moses, say the words pakod yifkod, those same words. And then the elders of the Israelites in Egypt came to Sarah because they knew that she had this experience. And at first she didn't believe, but as soon as she heard the words pakod yifkod, she had been the transmitter of that knowledge from the previous generation hundreds of years ago. And so then she was able to give the okay and say, yes, that is correct. He is the Redeemer. The time has finally come. So she's a transmitter of tradition, and they rely on her knowledge and her wisdom to then understand who's the true Redeemer of Israel. In a similar vein, I'm not going to get into it now, the Israelites promised Joseph that when they eventually left Egypt, that they would take his bones with them and bury them eventually in the promised land. But the thing is, they had forgotten the tradition as to where he had been buried. But Sarah, who had been alive then and was still alive, was able to transmit that information. So they were able to rely on her information. Finally, this idea about experience and tradition is actually defined as being wise, Isha Chachama, because there is an unnamed wise woman who's mentioned in the time of King David in 2 Samuels. And the later rabbis say, oh, there's an Isha Chachama, a wise woman, she must be Sarah Bat Asher. So they associate this wisdom with her as well. And finally, one more, that the idea is later on in the rabbis in the time of the Talmud are discussing, trying to understand what it looked like when the sea was split and what those walls of water actually looked like. And there's a rabbi in the time of the Talmud who said, well, they look like so-and-so. And apparently Sarah poked her head in to the yeshiva and said to them, no, I was there. In fact, you're wrong. They really looked this way. So she's able to use her wisdom and experience in that way as well. All right, I'm just going to leave it on this picture of Charlton Heston. I'm sorry for going over time. Are there any questions?
I don't think anybody minds that you go over time. It's wonderful. There are questions. I have a zillion, but the question, and I think it is a burning question, how come the name of Sarah gets lost? How come we've never heard of her? I mean, she's so important.
So Sarah, I'm sorry. Here we go. The Persian Jews took her and loved her, the Jews of Iran or Persia. And apparently this is the cemetery in Iran today, if it still exists, I'm not sure. And at least one generation, one group of Jews kept her story going on. And they said that she was living in Persia with them until the 12th century, and she died then. So that she didn't live forever, but she lived for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's a great question. It's a great question about women's history altogether, as to how, look, women existed in history. We know that.
Right.
History couldn't have existed without them. But why aren't their stories told? And it's so interesting to us. And that's why I actually called the series Extraordinary Women, because the idea is the ordinary ones have fallen through the cracks for us in history, but there were a few extraordinary ones who, if you dig hard enough, you can find them. How and why they got lost through history, I mean, that's the story of patriarchy or literacy or all kinds of things. But if Persian Jews apparently hang on to her story, though.
Okay. Wow. And then the other question, another sort of sensible question, could the Serach named in Numbers and other places be a descendant? Could they have kept the name and kept naming generations?
Yes, but that wouldn't be terribly exciting for us.
Right.
And also, it would have made a lot more sense if it had happened with other women as well. But she stands out not for really, I mean, the ideas are intertwined, but they're two separate ideas, but they're the same. Not only is she the same name used so many hundreds of years apart, it's the only female name used in each of those lists so many hundreds of years apart. So there's something weird going on there. So if you want to be rational, explain it your way, that's fine. Or you can go with this one.
Okay. Does the word Serach have a meaning?
The word Serach, I think it not definitively, and the problem is further amplified by the fact that in different places, sometimes it's spelled with a samach and sometimes with a sin. The same Hebrew letter has same sound in Hebrew can be manifested in two different letters. Right. And of course, that would change the meaning tremendously. So we'll leave that as a question mark.
Okay. And one more question. Did Joseph have any children? Are they mentioned in any of the Midrash?
Of course, Ephraim and Menashe. Oh, yes. So when we bless our sons to be like Ephraim and like Menashe, that those are Joseph's sons, and they have been elevated to be the equivalent of Jacob's sons, though. So those two grandchildren are of special importance, but they are in fact Joseph's sons.
Of course, we don't know that he had any daughters.
Well, that's the whole thing. We don't know about any of the daughters except for the very few that I've told you about. And but we know, I mean, just logically, daughters had to have been born, wives have to have existed, mothers happen to have been there, but we just don't hear about them. So I've brought you some of the few texts that do exist that emphasize those women that must have been there, but have not been recorded for us in the written Torah.
Okay, so one more that popped up. If you're naming a daughter, could you use the full name Serach bat Asher, followed by the name of the father?
Again, ask your rabbi.
Yeah,
Is this a practical question? I don't think it would make as much sense, although I have to tell you, there are different traditions. We don't have time for this, but a long time ago, actually speaking of the Jews of Persia, I don't think it was Persia, it was Jews from Azerbaijan. I'm sorry to conflate the two. A very long time ago, I lived in New York City, and actually right around this time of year, there was an organization, I forget what it was, who was arranging with newly immigrant or very poor Jews from Azerbaijan who lived in Queens, I believe, to get them money to buy wine and matzah for Pesach. But in order to do that, you have to kind of interview them and put them into the system and stuff like that. So I worked as a volunteer one year, putting them into the system, and I learned all kinds of very interesting names as part of that, because they obviously have very different traditions than ours. So on one hand, I wouldn't name her Sarach bat Asher, but on the other hand, one man that I met in that context, his Hebrew name, or his name, was a whole sentence in Hebrew, Manashir Tzion. So Manashir Tzion means how shall we sing in Zion, but it was all put together as one word. So his name was Manashir Tzion, which I would normally think of as a sentence, but in his case, it was a one-word name. So far be it for me, especially with a last name like Urowitz Freudenstein, to tell anyone what they should name themselves or their children. But ask your local rabbi. So
there are a couple of others, but I think we're going to have to close. I just have to tell you on a personal note, my husband's name is Usher. And at one point we were looking for an S name, and I wish I had known this story. But anyway. Somebody wrote, and I want to end with this because it's true. Anna, you rock. Thank you so much for a fun yet educational session on our women. So thank you again. This was terrific. We look forward to next week.